From our mayor, Jesse Arreguin. We'll hear from our mayor, Jesse Arreguin, and his support for the measure. And we'll also hear from Jim McGrath of Berkeleyans for Better Planning, which opposes the measure. Each of you will have 4 minutes to introduce yourselves and present your opening statements on the measure. After that, I will ask questions from our question bank, and you will each have 2 minutes to respond. We'll then move on to any questions that come into the Q&A. So for all of our attendees, you're welcome to submit questions into Q&A. Chat has been disabled for this program. On the screen with us as well is Chamber Board Member John Kaner. He is going to be our timekeeper today. He will give you a 30-second warning and then another alert when your time is up. So those are your cues. At the end of the forum, you'll each have 3 minutes to give your closing remarks. And I just want to also acknowledge my staff member, Robert Gillette, is also on this call to answer any tech questions through Q&A. Thanks for being here, Bobby. All right, so as predetermined, the mayor will have the floor first. So Mr. Mayor, welcome and take it away. You have 4 minutes.
Okay, give me 1 second to pull this up. I don't do PowerPoints that often, so.
We'll start when you're ready, don't worry.
Can everyone see the presentation? Okay,
yes.
Great. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. And I'm really pleased to speak in support of Measure L. And let me move. So Measure L is a bond measure with the capacity to provide transformative improvements to our community. The cost for the average assessed property is a little over $250 per year, less than $1 a day. The value that will be derived to our community is on a scale that we have not seen in generations. It's an investment that brings a once-in-a-generation opportunity to renew our city. So one key aspect of Measure L is to continue to address our affordable housing crisis. Measure L will provide $200 million, and it is stated in Section 4 of the measure, for affordable housing. This could provide an estimated 1,500 to 1,700 affordable homes in Berkeley. This builds on the success of our 2018 Measure O housing bond, which we have used to been able to finance roughly 800 affordable homes. Those funds are fully committed, and we need Measure L to continue the progress. Matching funds. Every Berkeley dollar that we put up for affordable housing, we get $5, nearly $5 in matching funds from county, state, or federal programs. If we do not provide those local dollars, that local match, our tax dollars will be spent in other communities. We're also hopefully going to be able to leverage new federal and state dollars for infrastructure and climate resilience. So failure to approve Measure L and to provide the local matching funds will mean that our tax dollars will be spent elsewhere. Measure L also includes $300 million for our streets, sidewalks, and paths. And a little over $230 million of that $300 million will go towards improving our crumbling streets, and $69 million for sidewalks, paths, bike and pedestrian infrastructure, and other street improvements. Question we get often is, why does it cost so much to maintain our infrastructure? And even with proper maintenance, our streets and sidewalks will eventually have to be redone. Much of our infrastructure is many decades old and is at the end of its useful life. And in addition, decades of underinvestment means that we must invest now to improve the condition of our infrastructure for future generations. The bottom line is it's time to reinvest. It's time to plan for the future. This year, the future of our city is on the ballot. Years of deferred maintenance, including some on this panel, have resulted in significant need. And without a significant infusion of funding to fix our streets, our sidewalks, our waterfront, our parks, and other public infrastructure, our infrastructure will continue to deteriorate and costs will escalate. The scale of improvements needed simply can't be accomplished with existing general funds. Even with significant increased street maintenance that the city has already committed, it is time to reinvest. Another aspect of Measure L is $50 million to underground 2 east-west evacuation routes to make sure proper egress for our first responders and our residents in the event of a fire or earthquake. That's why the Berkeley Firefighters Association strongly supports Measure L. On infrastructure improvements, You've certainly noticed that many of our parks, senior centers, and city facilities have been improved in recent years. I want to thank the voters for approving Measure T1. Throughout the pandemic, we've been working hard to improve our city, but existing funds, the funds that you have generously provided, have been committed or spent, and there's still more work to be done. In fact, we have over $1 billion in unfunded infrastructure needs even after the significant infusion of funding through Measure T1. And obviously, our historic Civic Center and Old City Hall is in need of improvement. Our waterfront is vulnerable to sea level rise. Facilities from the 1970s have deteriorated from age and exposure. South Berkeley hasn't had a pool since Willard Pool closed. Measure L provides the funding to finish our work to renew Berkeley on a
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Your time is up. And I'm sure you'll be able to address more of your points during the Q&A. Mr. McGrath.
The proceeds must be used for the measure's purposes. We have a single purpose oversight committee. Is my time up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
I could
Mayor.
talk about the endorsements at the end. Thank you very much.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. You can stop sharing your screen. And Mr. McGrath, once your screen is up, we'll start the time for you.
All right, I think you can see that. Good afternoon. Thank you. I think debate is at the heart of democracy, and I appreciate this opportunity. I've been a commissioner in Berkeley for about 17 years. I ran the campaign for the successful measures T1 that Jesse just talked about, and Measure F, an increase in the parks tax. And I was prepared to support a more modest measure here, but this thing to me doesn't work. So I'm going to give you my top 4 reasons why this doesn't work. First, there's the loophole. There's a giant loophole that will allow this money to be spent on virtually anything that qualifies for bond funding. So there's no guarantees. Let me make sure, is this going to go down? The next aspect has to do with spending bond funding with the interest that's associated with it for things which will not last and will not be assets at the end of it. First of all, using bonds for street repair rather than something that goes pay as you go has a huge unfair impact. This gives you 2 homeowners who bought at different times, and because of Proposition 13, over the life of the bond, one will pay much more. This is relevant to me because I've been in my house a long time. My next door neighbor pays about 4 times as much. I want a more equitable, fairer solution. I mentioned that structures should be durable. Asphalt is not. This is a picture I took yesterday at Berkeley Marina in the parking lot. That's 4-year-old pavement, 4 years old. So we're looking at 30-year bonds that will be paid off by our children for things that may last 4 to 7 years. Now there's the question about, there's been a sense that this has to happen right now. There's no money, we're out of money. Indeed, I think the mayor said that all the money for Measure O was committed. Actually, if you look at the report that went to the council finally on Tuesday, only $78 million of the bonds for Measure O have actually been sold. Many of those projects are years, perhaps even more than a decade out. There is time to let the staff continue to do their good work on that and generate funds and make sure that the housing is program, when it's reauthorized, and I certainly would support that, has the necessary level of oversight that we think has been missing. Now I come to my 4th point, oversight. Why am I talking about oversight? Well, here's the guarantees. This is the ballot argument for Measure P. Measure P was an increase in the property transfer tax, and it said it was going to generate funds for navigation centers, etc. But then the final budget swept $6 million of that into the general fund. What happened to the money? Don't complain to the Schultz foundation. I haven't used this with any permission, and I've modified it a little bit. But we need accountability. We need accountability, which we think is missing in Measure FF. We think it's missing in Measure P, and we think it needs to be here so that there's strict accountability. So we're absolutely willing to work on a ballot measure or measures that have all of these things. So we're not, I've been described by some of the anti-tax people as, well, you're kind of pro-tax. I'm pro-efficient spending. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll now move on to our question bank. We'll begin with the mayor. So you'll be able to answer the question first. You'll have 2 minutes. And then Mr. McGrath, you will have an additional 2 minutes to respond. Mr. Mayor, why such a large bond measure and not separate bond measures and/or parcel taxes funding different projects?
So as some may know, we did explore the possibility of a separate streets parcel tax and a bond to address infrastructure and affordable housing. And I just want to, briefly address the point Mr. McGrath said. Yes, only 111 million has been actually spent in Measure O funds. The way that you do bond issuances is that you actually issue the bonds when you need to spend the money. The money's been committed. These are projects that we needed to make funding commitments for so they can leverage state and federal revenues, and we will issue those bonds to be able to help provide the money when those projects need to draw on the bonds. But that aside, the actual tax burden by two combined measures would have been far more significant than one bond. And moreover, we need to ask for a significant amount of resources because of decades of deferred maintenance. Mr. McGrath served on the Public Works Commission for many years. Why haven't we made the scale of investment at our waterfront? I've only been mayor for 5 years, but I recognize that we have decades of deferred maintenance to address at our waterfront, our streets, our sidewalks, our civic center. And given the scale of need, 1 billion unfunded infrastructure needs, and that is going to keep increasing if we don't address it now, we do need Measure L now. So rather than putting two measures on the ballot, which would have cost $700 for the average assessed home, we wanted to be mindful of the economic impact of such a significant proposal. And that's why we decided to move forward with one bond, comprehensive bond, addressing the myriad of needs, significant needs that the city has to address decades of underinvestment and to be able to renew our city for the future. That's what Measure L is about. It's about making sure that future generations have a better city. It's good for business, it's good for homeowners, it's good for the long-term interests of the city.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. McGrath, would you like me to reread the question?
No, I think I've got the question. So I did serve, I think, about 2 years on the Public Works Commission, and that commission was responsible for recommending a 5-year pavement plan. And when I was on it, it recommended, as it had for years, that the city needed to increase its funding to about 12 million a year to make any progress. So the problem that we have, I think I've made the point that bonds, which have a 30-year payout for improvements that last 4 to 15 years, do not make sense. To the question of cost, what was originally proposed was a property assessment for the streets. It would have expired in a period of years. One of the things that I'd like to tell you is it took about 12 years so far to spend the $100 million worth of T1. I know about this because I spent about 8 years kind of bird dogging it and making sure that the money was well spent. It does take time to put together projects. So I absolutely agree with this question. Spend some money, show that you've actually made a difference. I mean, 3 years ago, I recommended that the council increase funding for streets. Finally, they did it this year. They've done it for one budget. Improve some streets, let the tax for that expire, show the city that you're more serious about investing in and maintaining infrastructure. And then I think the public appetite for such measures will be greater. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, you'll take this next question first, and then Mr. Mayor will respond. Mr. McGrath, those opposing the measure claim that Measure L does not have enough oversight. Please explain how oversight of Measure L compares to prior bond measures.
You know, there's a premise to this question, which is, well, we added some stuff on Tuesday this week that was taken out of Measure T1. So I'm gonna go back to the history. The council did put Measure T1 on the ballot with no guardrails around it at all. So we went back to the council and said, look, we can't run a campaign like this. You've got to put something in it. What we had at that time is we had an equity study that had been done for all of Berkeley's parks. We had infrastructure lists for the parks, for the roads, for the buildings. So we knew what the improvements were. And we convinced the council to adopt a measure for that, which was subsequent to the original, but well before it was, before the ballots were mailed, that talked about infrastructure. It talked about durability. It talked about equity. And it talked about, what was the other measure? And it talked about requiring the city to prepare a program plan that went on and identified the things that needed to be done. So I don't buy the premise. I mean, I would have written T1 differently if I'd been on the council. We patched it as well as we could with the council we had at the time and ran a campaign for a much smaller bond. It took a lot of work to keep it in line. I think you should learn from that measure and put that material and put those boundaries in the bond rather than in something that you pass by the council 2 months after the bond has been sent to the voters.
Mr. Mayor, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah, if you could, that'd be great.
Sure. Those opposing the measure claim that Measure L does not have enough oversight. Please explain how oversight of Measure L compares to prior bond measures.
Sure. If I can share screen. So this is the actual text of Measure L, and I want to refer people to Section 7, the accountability requirements. And it's pretty clear that the money can only be used for the acquisition improvement of improvements. And there's a lot of misinformation being put out there, some of it probably deliberately. Maybe people aren't reading the measure close enough, but we define what improvements are. We say the affordable housing improvements are for the acquisition and improvement of real property for affordable and social housing. That's clearly defined in the measure. We define what public works improvements are. So you can only spend the money for those improvements. And there is robust information in here about accountability, reporting requirements that the city manager needs to report to the city council and how the funds are spent. A separate oversight committee is created for the purpose of ongoing oversight of the bond expenditures. 3 different commissions will make recommendations to the city council on how we should spend the money in addition to our robust public process. And I agree that T1 is a good guidepost to use. And I think we did a good job through a robust public process to be able to allocate the money from Measure T1. We've expended all the money. We've committed all the money. That's why we need Measure L. But I'll just point, we put together a spreadsheet that compares Measure T1 to Measure L. And I just want to call attention to, and I may use this throughout the discussion, oversight and accountability. There was no oversight committee or independent audit requirements in Measure T1. Measure L requires extensive oversight requirements, reporting requirements. There were limited reporting requirements in Measure T1. Measure L has the most robust reporting requirements and the role of an oversight committee. Measure L talks about public engagement in detail, much more than Measure T1. And then with respect to plans, you know, one of the statements is that there is no plan. There hasn't been any planning. Mr. McGrath was part of the Vision 2050 process. There's been more planning to lead to the development of Measure L than any measure that the city has put forward on infrastructure. That is simply inaccurate. I want to address.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. All right, this next question will go to you first. Mr. Mayor, it's our understanding that council this week made significant updates to the measure. Please discuss the pros and cons of those changes.
Certainly. Well, we did what they did in 2016, which is to provide additional guidance if the measure were to pass on how we are going to ensure public process, accountability, and oversight. And if I could share screen once again. And this also is posted on our website, renewberkeley.org. So the resolution that the city council adopted explicitly talks about the limitation of the use of funds. It says specific expenditure priorities, that we commit that if the measure passes, we will spend the money as follows. There was no such commitment with respect to Measure T1. There's specific information and guidance on public participation, active public participation, community process, engagement of boards and commissions and our city staff in developing project plans. And ultimately, these decisions are made by the city council. Specifies that we will use adopted plans and policies, including our bike pedestrian plan, stormwater management plan, street rehabilitation policy, undergrounding report, Vision 2050 program plan. We already have a program plan that's going to guide how we spend Measure L. Specific guidance about reporting requirements, that 2 formal reports will be provided to the city council each year on how the funds are spent. This delineating the role of the bond oversight committee in detail, as well as information on the annual audits that are required and information on transparency through a website to provide ongoing reports about how the funds are spent. And lastly, to look at requiring independent construction project management, somebody outside of the city to oversee the contracting process and how construction is going, to make sure that we stay on budget and we stay on time. These requirements, these are requirements that people will say it's not binding. A resolution is a binding policy of the city council. It will guide how this bond is implemented, just like the proponents of Measure T1 did in 2016. This will provide specificity and a commitment that we will have oversight and accountability in addition to what's in the measure.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, shall I repeat the question?
No, I understand the question and I understand Jesse's answer. I disagree with him. Certainly, as I said on Tuesday night, this is a distinct improvement. I'm glad they found the T1 measure, but this is the kind of material that should have been in the initial resolution and should have been referenced in the bond. That's the only way it becomes enforceable. I think Jesse is wrong or misadvised. You can't bind a future council. One of the problems with this, and I think it goes back to the last question, is the kind of show me problem that has to do with whether or not there was enough accountability in past measures and whether or not we've made progress. The idea behind this is issuing bonds over an 18-year period. You can't build everything at once. It will take time. But what goes first in this priority, there's going to be a giant debate over that. And are you really ready? Just one rebuttal to Jesse's comment. I was in the Vision 2050. I've actually read the program plan. The parts for streets is 3 pages long. It doesn't tell anybody in Berkeley when their street might actually get paved. And so the improvements that were passed on Tuesday, certainly a better improvement. Certainly, I think this council can be held to those. I don't think it applies to future councils.
Thank you. All right, Mr. McGrath, this question will go to you first. What happens if Measure L does not pass, and how can we be assured that the conditions of our street will really improve with the passage of Measure L?
Let me take the condition of the streets first. It's not easy for people who haven't worked in an engineering field and haven't looked at these things to understand how difficult it is. How hard could it be? Can't we just put something on the streets that smooths them out? Well, you can. It's called a slurry seal, and it lasts a couple of years. It would make the streets look really good for a couple of years, but it wouldn't last. You need to go into the streets and look at whether or not there are utility corridors that are the underlying problem. So work needs to be done, and that work needs to be prioritized. And I think the current public works manager has done a good job at starting to get a more realistic idea of how bad the problem is. But translating that into measures is much more difficult. So what would happen if it doesn't pass? What we've said consistently is we will work with the council. And if the council doesn't want to work with us, we'll work as an initiative to create one or more measures that are cheaper, that have the accountability written into them, and that would be passed over a period of time consistent with what you can actually do to implement these things. So I'm in this for the long haul. I've been working on Berkeley's infrastructure for 17 years. I was ready to support another one. In fact, I wrote an op-ed piece about what wonderful job had been done at Aquatic Park, anticipating that another 100 to 200 million in infrastructure. But there's no plan for the marina. There's no plan at all for sea level rise. There's nobody that's been working on sea level rise resiliency in Berkeley for the last year. Berkeley has not availed itself of the grants at the Adapting to Rising Tides. There are measures that will plan these things and try to orient what we need to do in a sense of priorities. For right now, the climate disasters in the hills, and we need to know comprehensively what we do to get people out of the hills safely.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, shall I repeat or you're good?
I understand the question. So I just want to briefly address something with respect to a prior comment that was made. Resolutions are binding policy of the city council. They apply to all councils. There's a new city council that took office in 2016. The guidance that was adopted in 2016 on Measure T1 applies to that city council. So that's a factually incorrect statement I want to clarify. In addition, we have hundreds of millions of dollars of street needs. This is decades in the making. We can't just put in 7 million here and 15 million here a year and expect that we're going to solve the problem. We need a significant infusion of resources, and we need a commitment for ongoing maintenance funding, which the city council has met through a binding budget policy that we're going to commit $15 million a year in addition to whatever money may come from Measure L. So whatever investments we make through Measure L, we will make sure that we can maintain those streets so that we're not in a situation that we're in now. And this is an issue that's decades in the making. And what will happen if Measure L doesn't pass? Well, if we're really committed to fixing our infrastructure, we're really committed to addressing our housing and homeless crisis, then you should vote for Measure L, because we will not have the money to be able to address those critical issues, which the voters have said consistently are their top priorities. So what will happen if Measure L doesn't pass? We will not be able to fund hundreds, if not thousands of units of affordable housing because we won't have that local match. That money will go elsewhere. What happens if Measure L doesn't pass? We'll have more homelessness on our streets. What happens if Measure L doesn't pass? Our streets will further deteriorate, costing more money to our taxpayers to be able to fix our streets and creating safety issues for people. What happens if Measure L doesn't pass? Our sidewalks will not be fixed. Our waterfront will not be improved. We will not be able to renew and improve our civic center. We need to recognize that we need to take action now. We cannot wait 2 more years. It's going to cost us more. And also, how much more are we going to be impacted by the lack of good infrastructure and the lack of affordable housing? This is about the investment in our city for future generations. And I urge our residents to do the right thing, to think about the future of our city, the best interests of our city, to put parochial issues aside and to support this critical once-in-a-generation investment for our city.
Thank you. All right, we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask my final prepared question, and then we'll move to the audience questions. Mr. Mayor, there are a lot of competing priorities under Measure L, particularly for other infrastructure projects, such as the pier, pools, parks, the Civic Center. How will funding be allocated?
Excellent question. I think this gets to something that we addressed in the resolution that we adopted on Tuesday. We are going to use a very similar process to what we used for Measure T1. And the resolution that we adopted, and I can share screen again, is that there will be active public participation in determining the projects that will be recommended through the bonds and citizen oversight of bond expenditures, that we will have an extensive public process similar to the implementation of T1, gathering input from boards and commissions, staff through public meetings and surveys to get input on project priorities. Our staff will develop initial recommendations on the highest priority projects. And those recommendations will be presented to commissions and the public for further discussion and for public input. And we will use the various policies that the city had adopted our bicycle and pedestrian plan, our stormwater management plan, our street rehabilitation policy, our undergrounding report, our Vision 2050 framework and program plan. There is plans, there is planning. We are going to use those plans to guide how we spend the money. And then lastly, I just want to call attention, the measure explicitly says, I want to debunk this misinformation. The measure explicitly says $200 million will go for affordable housing improvements and $450 million will go for infrastructure improvements. And we made an explicit commitment on Tuesday that $300 million will go for streets, sidewalks, and traffic safety, of which $231 million for street paving and reconstruction, $69 million for bike and ped improvements, $50 million for undergrounding, and $100 million for other infrastructure priorities. We will use a public process. We will lean on the great work of our citizen boards and commissions, and citizen input will be a critical component of how we prioritize these projects.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath?
Between the question and what Jesse just said, so Jesse mentioned the marina and the plans that we have in place. You know, I spent 7 years trying to get the city to start a new marina plan because we knew that his lordships was going out of business. They finally put it into it. It's bogged down in controversy over development at Cesar Chavez Park. It's at least 2 years away from any level of completion. He also mentioned the stormwater management plan. Well, I've read the stormwater management. I've read the resilience plan. The stormwater management plan, the most recent version, dates back to 2012. It has nothing in it about sea level rise. And sea level rise starts at the Bay, and you have to work with Caltrans and you have to work with East Bay Regional Park District to do anything. No work's been done on that. So how will the money be allocated? This is the perfect question. So the marina needs $112 million from the last measure. We need $100 million for one of Jesse's pet projects, a ferry. We need $35 to $50 million for San Pablo Park, depending on whether or not you just do a pool or you do a pool in a civic center. $70 million for the downtown buildings. There will be a food fight over these things. There will be a huge food fight over who gets what. And with streets, the question, although the improvement that the council put back in on Tuesday, that this be used for durable structure, there'll be a food fight over whether or not the bonds should be used for temporary pavement improvements. So complete the plans. The city finally gave money for planning hill safety, which Lori Drosty had been looking for years. We need to complete a marina plan that looks at feasibility. And we need to complete an update of the runoff plans. And Liam Garland got money for that this year. So let's finish the plans. Let's roll them out at a pace we can actually do things. And but don't tell me the 2012 plan is the definitive thing that we're going to rely on for sea level rise when there's nothing in it about sea level. Please.
All right, thank you. Okay, like I said, we have many questions in the Q&A, so I am going to move over to those. So I'm just going to start here, and I apologize if we don't get to all of them. We'll do our best. Mr. Mayor, it looks like this one is for you first. When the mayor says that our tax dollars will be spent elsewhere, what tax dollars is he referring to? The same dollars that Measure L would ask a select group to pay?
No. Well, we pay federal and state taxes, so those dollars are allocated. So money through state budget appropriations for tax credits that can go towards affordable housing, that money's going to go to Oakland or other jurisdictions if we don't provide that local match. Money through new federal bills, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, it's going to provide an unprecedented opportunity to be able to leverage local dollars to invest in electrification, electric vehicle infrastructure, improving infrastructure, transportation. And if we don't have the local resources, we're going to lose on those funds, and that's going to go to other jurisdictions. But one thing I want to just say is that, you know, I keep hearing the opponents of Measure L keep moving the goalposts. Oh, we need accountability and oversight. We've addressed that. We need plans. We've addressed that. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, are we really committed to the city or not? Are we committed in having a better Berkeley or not? I think that's really the question that we need to decide. And do we want to take the step of creating a better city or not? How long are we going to wait to do that?
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, would you care to comment?
I did. Jesse has asked if I'm committed to Berkeley. I've spent 17 years in meetings, countless meetings about how to improve Berkeley. I've spent time in subcommittee meetings for the fiscal condition of the marina. I've written op-ed pieces. I've run and spent my own money on T1 and F and spent hundreds of hours. Jesse, how dare you ask whether I'm committed to Berkeley? How dare you say that? I want the money that we spent to go as far as it possibly can and to be as transparent as it possibly can. And until Tuesday, there was little of that. We may disagree and hopefully would do it a little more politely about whether or not it's binding. But how dare you infer that the 17 years I put in were not for the good of my city? You've offended me mightily.
Okay, this next question is addressed to Mr. McGrath. Mr. McGrath, in March of 2020, voters overwhelmingly approved 3 BUSD tax measures for infrastructure, maintenance, housing at a total annual cost of $38 million in new taxes. Measure L will have annual cost of $21 million for the same 3 areas of concern. In addition, the $15 million in maintenance costs of streets will be paid out of existing revenues. Both the city's and BUSD's tax measure have similar oversight and level of detail. If you approved the 3 BUSD measures, why do you oppose Measure L?
Well, a couple of things. Let's get the math correct on the 15 million. The city put, for the first time, after years of pleading, more money than the 1.9 million into maintenance. The other 7 million comes from state and county taxes that must be spent on the roads. So let's just be clear about where the money comes from. The city for years put 1.9 million while it lost purchasing power. Maybe it's my fondness for schools. Maybe you don't know that I've spent the last 17 years volunteering in Berkeley City schools. But the schools all had identified deficiencies in the physical plants. And they've had improvements that I was volunteering at Malcolm X when those improvements went in. They were done very well. Dan Lindheim was the head of that effort. And, sometimes a very good person, and Dan is one of those, can make an imperfect oversight measure work. My issues with oversight really stem from the careless wording in Measure P and in Measure FF, where the oversight hasn't occurred. And even for Measure O, one of the things that the report on Tuesday came out with was the number of meetings that have actually been held, and the reporting for Measure O was minimal. The last report to the council was in March of 2021. Looking at I'm sorry, I didn't scan in the measure, but it says this is from Tuesday's agenda. The commission met 7 times in 2019, 1 in 2020 prior to the pandemic, and again in February and March of 2021. So I think there needs to be a constant presence of oversight and better communication. The fact that we did something once and it worked sort of does not mean that we shouldn't improve it.
Mr. Mayor, would you like to respond?
Sure. Well, the proof is in the projects. Yesterday, I had my State of the City. It was good to see both Beth and John were actually at the Berkeley Hope Center. That was the first Measure O project we constructed. Jordan Court at Cedar and Oxford, the first affordable housing project in North Berkeley in 30 years, and many other projects that have been funds are committed or financed, including hundreds of affordable homes that we hope will be built at the North Berkeley and Ashby BART station. The proof is in the projects. North Berkeley Senior Center, the Rose Garden, and a renewed University Avenue at the Marina. We have been delivering projects. There has been robust public process, some of which Mr. McGrath had participated in. And Mr. McGrath, I just want to clarify, I in no way was, speaking to you, I was speaking generally that we as Berkeley residents, that we need to do what's good for the future of the city. And if we care about leaving our city in a better condition for future generations, I believe, it's my opinion, I believe that we should embrace and support Measure L. But I guess I'll just say that the projects that we have been delivering, we've committed all the money in Measure O in 4 years, and the need is still significant. We have committed all the money in Measure T1. We have $1 billion in unfunded infrastructure needs. The longer we wait, the more people will be experiencing homelessness, the more people will be pushed out of our city because they can't afford to live here, including working professionals. The more our streets are going to crumble, our sidewalks will buckle, our infrastructure costs will increase, the less we'll be prepared to adapt to the threat of climate change, the more that we'll have evacuation routes where poles will fall down and people and emergency responders can't get through. These are serious needs that we have to address now. And that's why I urge my fellow Berkeley residents to support Measure L.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Mayor, we'll start with you for this next question. Older Berkeley homeowners are concerned about the cost for them for Measure L, the annual cost. Many claim that the cost they will not be able to afford. Will there be special rules for these senior homeowners, perhaps arrangements for them to pay less based on their complete financial picture?
Well, state bond law, unfortunately, does not allow for there to be an exemption or rebate for low-income seniors. However, one of the things that we were mindful of when we were looking at putting forward a measure or measures on the ballot this November was what is the total cumulative cost to the taxpayer? And many of these people have properties that have not been assessed in many years due to Proposition 13. And so the actual cost will not be that significant to these long-term homeowners. But if we put two measures in the ballot, as some had suggested, a separate streets tax and a bond, that would have been over $700 per assessed home, average assessed home. That's a very significant tax burden. And so we were very thoughtful in terms of how we developed the bond measure to look at how we amortize the costs so that we can pay for the significant needs that we have as a city now and be able to reduce the tax burden on an annual basis to taxpayers. So there was a lot of great thought, a lot of consultation of our bond counsel and financial experts in terms of how we develop this bond measure. And some of our existing bonds and taxes will be sunsetting over the Horizons bond measure, which will further reduce the tax burden to the average taxpayer in the city of Berkeley.
Mr. McGrath, would you like to respond?
A couple of things. There was an assumption on the tax burden analysis that was done that there was kind of batted back and forth between some of the concerned citizens in Berkeley and the financial staff at the city. They're assuming a 4.0% interest rate for bonds over the life. But the measure allows up to 12%. So, the rates are up over 4% now. I hope they go down. Certainly, I agree with spending bond money at a rate that it's affordable, particularly as other measures expire. What that would argue for me is fairly specific bond measures in a series over the period of time as those other measures are paid off. But remember, Measure M, the street repair project, doesn't expire till 2044. Now, it's not a big bond, it's only $30 million, but those improvements are already deteriorating. So let's go to the burden on houses and the seniors question. The city had before them, when Jesse combined these two different measures, a housing measure with infrastructure and a parcel tax for streets. It was at 30 cents. The budget for that did not consider the $7 million a year that comes in from the county, which can be spent for any road purpose. Now, the advantage of a parcel tax is that you can make adjustments for senior citizens. It doesn't have to be as high as what is suggested, and you can basically gather the money to fix the roads according to the numbers that they have, 231 million over a period of about 10 years, sunset the act and then go forward with other measures. So, if you do the math pretty carefully, you can do this more cheaply over time. You avoid about $100 million worth of interest, assuming that we get the 4% just on the roads.
Thank you. Our next question, and Mr. McGrath, you can answer first. Is this measure the only way to claim the matching federal funds?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, when, it's interesting that all of a sudden there's a report for the first time since March 2021 on housing that says, boy, the money's already gone. Well, I did listen on all these meetings, and I was prepared to support some measures at the next to the last meeting, when all of a sudden it became one measure instead of two. The housing person for the city said, we spent $45 million and we're doing a pretty good job on getting numbers. Turns out that they've actually pulled down a little more than that. So there's money there for housing. Now, have all the kind of shoes dropped in terms of federal and state funding on homeless programs? No. And at some point, you might want to take some of the money that is now pledged for Ashby and North Berkeley, which are at least a little bit controversial, and which, according to the city manager's report, are at least 10 years out, and put it to other measures. So I think there are ways to spend money and make sure that you don't lose advantage. But I would also comment that housing is a regional problem. And I think it might be a good idea for Oakland, who's had an increase in homelessness, to build some homeless housing. So.
Mr. Mayor?
That's not the Berkeley way. We don't run away from problems. We face them head on. And I'm proud that we've demonstrated leadership these past 5 years in addressing our housing crisis and the need for our infrastructure. Yes, housing is a regional problem. I am the president of the Association of Area Governments. I know that full well. But we have a responsibility to house the people that are here in our city, the kids that grew up here who can't live here, the teachers and working professionals that need housing in our city, our unhoused neighbors who are on our streets. We have a responsibility to address that too. We can't run away from that. That's why I feel it is critical that we move Measure L forward. That's why the nonprofit housing associations endorsed Measure L, the Housing Action Coalition, and many other affordable housing organizations. But I mean, are we really suggesting that we're going to defund projects that we've already funded? That we're not going to have 35% affordable housing at our BART stations? Even though the community said overwhelmingly they want affordable housing on BART property. That's not going to happen. I'll just say briefly with respect to an issue that was raised previously. The reason that we're in this mess to begin with is, one, previous mayors and previous city councils did not prioritize investing in our infrastructure, and the measures that we put forward were not ambitious enough in their scope to address the problem. And we did not provide the annual funding for maintenance, which we are now doing through the fiscal policy we adopted. So we can't Mickey Mouse this and piecemeal this. We have critical needs. We are responding to the need for affordable housing, climate resiliency, and improving our infrastructure. The longer we wait, the more it's going to cost us. We have to step up now. We have to be bold and ambitious in our vision for the future of our city. And yes, those matching dollars will go to other jurisdictions if we do not have the local dollars here in Berkeley to help finance these projects.
Thank you. All right, our next question, a nice segue from what you just said, Mr. Mayor. Why isn't street maintenance part of our regular city budget? Why has there been neglect and deferred maintenance?
Well, I can't speak to what prior mayors or city councils have done. I've only been mayor for 5 years. But when we did Measure M in 2012, it was a $40 million bond. We thought that that was going to be enough to be able to fix our streets, but we didn't keep up fast enough with the degradation of our streets, and the money was not committed for ongoing maintenance. Mr. McGrath is correct. It was about $2 million in annual funding. Measure T1 did boost that amount. I was actually the person that put into Measure T1 that we would be able to fund streets. So we didn't prioritize it. It wasn't enough. And I've inherited a problem as the mayor of the city that has been decades in the making. But I'm not going to pass the buck on to the next generation. And our streets are in such bad condition that increasing numbers of claims of people tripping and falling that the city has to pay out. Our streets are not designed to be safe for pedestrians and bicyclists. We're seeing an increasing number of collisions and even some fatalities. That's unacceptable. That will not help us achieve our Vision Zero goals. So now is the time. Now is the time to invest in the future of our city. We cannot keep pushing this problem on to generation after generation. We have to invest now. With over $231 million in needs to rehabilitate our streets, $15 million is not going to be enough to be able to solve that. We need a significant infusion of resources for us to fix all of our streets in Berkeley. Measure L will help us rehabilitate 97% of our city streets from the hills to the bay, and also to implement complete streets improvements to make our streets safer for bicyclists and pedestrians, and to be able to leverage those Alameda County Transportation Commission and MTC dollars to be able to do these transformative projects so that our streets are safer for people of all modes and abilities. And so we really need, we just can't keep passing the buck and sort of piecemealing this and putting a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there. We need a significant scale of resources to deal with the significant scale of the problem now.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, would you care to respond?
Sure. First of all, I did write an op-ed piece that we need to put more money into our streets 3 years ago. And I don't remember any measure that increased the 1.9 million from any of the council member or for the mayor. I basically begged them to start creating an understanding among the citizens before they came up with a bond that they were seriously committed. So I've been banging this drum for quite a while. What does it take? That's the other part of this. There's a certain amount of magical thinking that we can somehow fix our streets overnight. Berkeley has 210 miles of street, 210, 216. It's been approving about 3 miles a year. If you were to try to fix all of those streets in 10 years, that means you're going to take the 3 miles a year up to 21 miles a year. That's a 7-fold increase. It's difficult to do that. You need to make sure that you've done the engineering, that you don't simply cover over a street that has a failing subsurface structure, because 2 years later, it'll be bad. You can see that they just had to repave Fulton because of poor settling. So this is something that will take some time. The Public Works Director, Liam Garland, presented the city with a 30-year time frame. I don't like the idea that somehow we can magically do this in 10 years when we've been doing 3 miles a year.
All right, thank you. And I apologize, my internet just got a little shaky there for a second. Okay, Mr. Mayor, this one is for you. Measure L anticipates an 18-year.
So just to clarify.
Okay. Measure L anticipates an 18-year series of bonds, but the measure does not specify which of the promises will be funded first and last. How will that be decided? And why do we need to authorize bonds now that won't be issued until 2040, when we will have a different council with who knows what priorities?
Well, with the affordable housing, that money is very clear. It's to fund the construction and rehabilitation of affordable and social housing. That's clear. So we will be issuing bonds to be able to finance that. With respect to the infrastructure improvements, it's really going to, we have plans, we have policies, we have a roadmap through the Vision 2050 program plan that identifies the 1 billion in unfunded infrastructure needs and kind of identifies what are the key priorities. What will guide the allocation of bond funds is the public process, the work of our boards and commissions, our program plan, the ability for us to leverage resources. And really, it's about adaptive planning. It's about not just addressing the needs now, but having the resources to address what those needs may be in the future. So part of what Measure L will do is address the critical needs now and ensure that we can address the needs within that horizon as well. Because we don't know what's going to happen. Our climate emergency is going to probably be far worse than it is now. And we want to be in a position to be able to make the investments so our city can be resilient. and we can have improved infrastructure, and we can have climate resilience as well. So some of this is delineated in the oversight resolution that we recently adopted. And once again, please go to renewberkeley.org to read that resolution in full and to get more information about the accountability, oversight, and public process that we'll be employing for the expenditure of the bond funds.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, would you care to respond?
Can you repeat that question?
Yes. Measure L anticipates an 18-year series of bonds, but the measure does not specify which of the priorities will be funded first and last. How will that be decided? And why do we need to authorize bonds now that won't be issued until 2040, when we will have a different council with who knows what priorities?
Well, let me start by saying I agree with the thrust of the question. That's a long time to authorize and to assume that you know the priorities. And then let me also agree with Jesse that I agree that housing should be one of our priorities. And to the degree that a far more robust oversight process would have been in a standalone measure for housing, I'd have voted for it. That's not what we got. We got that tacked on with a very expensive road fix and a big pot of money that's going to be fought over. So why do I say that? And let's go back to my thinking in 2018 when I voted for Measure P and Measure O. We had a housing crisis. We had money. We had $130 or $135 million. And then we had in Measure P a promise to provide the social services that are necessary to figure out who you can put in a new housing unit, and they're not going to shoot drugs in it or set it on fire because they had, some imaginary friends visit. So there was a two-part program that aimed at the neediest of us and had the social piece. But that money went away. It went to the general fund, $6 million of it. And one line in the budget as to why. There's a lot of pushback. Measure FF had an oversight process. So if Jesse had proposed or comes back with a housing program as the first priority, with these measures in and integrated, I'll support it. The rest of it, we're talking about a food fight. And I've been through that food fight. I spent 8 years on T1 balancing differing positions. The robust public process worked. The last allocation went to the council with unanimous votes from the responsible commissions, and it was on the consent calendar. But there's a lot of work that went behind that.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. This next question comes from someone who has served on a commission in the past. I have seen how easily city staff could oppose a commission's proposal. Why should I trust this process if the city council might follow the staff and not the commission? Mr. Mayor.
Well, first, I just have to respond. Mr. McGrath had said something that I thought was rather inappropriate, stigmatizing homeless people. Not all homeless people are drunks or arsonists. Let's just be honest with you. We had people that lost their housing during this pandemic that are on our streets, that are living in vehicles. Our city, we are a compassionate, thoughtful city. That's why people supported Measure P. That's why people supported Measure O. We've been working hard to allocate those dollars. $17 million in Measure P receipts, the vast majority of which have funded 16 new programs. Our Grayson Shelter, our state parking site, permanent housing subsidies, our street medicine team, a trust clinic. I mean, I can go on about, and that's why we've had a 5% reduction in unsheltered homelessness compared to the county's 20% increase in the point in time count. So I believe that we are a thoughtful, compassionate city. I'm grateful for the generosity of our voters, and that is making a difference. But we need to do more. There's no question about it. But could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Certainly. Let's see. I have served on a commission. I have seen how easily this.
Yeah. So I guess I value, as a former citizen commissioner, very much the input of our boards and commissions. And ultimately, it is the responsibility of the elected city council. We have a representative democracy to hold our city administration accountable. The city manager works for the city council. And I have worked to push for the recommendations of boards and commissions, such as our soda tax panel, when the staff have disagreed. because I do value the recommendations. The Measure P panel of experts, the vast majority of their recommendations were reflected in the expenditure plan that the city council had approved. And yes, we did use some money this year to backfill some existing services because we had faced a budget deficit. I'll just note Measure P is a general tax, not a special tax. And we are listening to the input of the panel of experts. We are listening to the input of the Disaster and Fire Safety Commission. We are investing money in vegetation management and in fire prevention. And the input of our boards and commissions is meaningful and valuable, but ultimately it's the elected city council that makes the decisions in a public process and that holds the staff accountable, and I'm committed to that.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, would you care to respond?
Well, yeah, I'm going to take issue with something that Jesse said. I didn't characterize the homeless community writ large as drug addicts. There's more than 1,000 people who are homeless. Some of them have mental illness and drug addiction problems. I heard you and Sophie describe that number when you first came into office. It is that group. Well, in fact, it's all of the group of homeless people that need social services to make sure that they can manage to get into housing and they can stay in housing. What you said is, well, we wrote it so we could put it in the general fund, and we only took 6 million, and there's still 17 million in there. That's pretty good. I don't think that's good enough. And to me, that's why we write accountability into the measures, and we do a better job than we have in the past. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, this next one, we'll go to the mayor first and then Mr. McGrath. The mayor says that there is a vision for sea level rise adaptation, yet a recent proposal for a bike park in Marina had no sea level rise considerations. Who will pay for that infrastructure repair when it fails? And is this indicative of future planning in the Marina?
Well, there's a proposal for a bike park, but no decision's been made on that. So I just want to clarify that for the record. I'm very involved in discussions around sea level rise issues. I serve as an alternate commissioner on the Bay Conservation Development Commission. I'm part of our Financing the Future, vice chair of our Financing the Future working group. I'm president of the Association of Bay Area Governments. We're leading regional conversations. This is not a Berkeley problem. There are many cities along the Bay that don't have a clear roadmap for how we're going to address this issue. And we need to address that. Our staff have identified projects at the waterfront that will enable our city to be able to adapt to the threat of sea level rise. And clearly there's more work to do. I just came out of a meeting this afternoon where there is billions and billions of dollars of projects in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's only so much money available. And so that's why you need those local resources to be able to help support this work. And I haven't heard the opponents of Measure L tell me how they're going to be able to fund sea level rise adaptation if the measure fails. And there's new state dollars that are coming through the governor's budget to help support this. How are we going to be able to tap into those dollars to address this issue? So we are planning. There's more that we have to do, and we need the money to be able to do the infrastructure to be able to have our city prepared.
Mr. McGrath?
There's two parts to this. First of all, the Marina staff did do a pretty good sea level rise study for the Marina only. And they've built the improvements, including university, to be long lasting. At some point, probably about 70 years down the road, you're either going to need a huge investment or you're going to have to amortize the improvements out there. If sea level rise of over 10 feet occurs, we won't have a marina as it is now. So that's the first part. The second part is I was also a BCDC commissioner for 14 years and worked pretty hard on trying to create a framework for adaptive management. I spent a couple of years trying to get the 3 cities and the East Bay Regional Park District and Caltrans to all start planning for a regional approach to sea level rise. But there's no effort on the city staff person. Now, Jesse has just said that we need to have bond money waiting. Actually, what you need to do is you need to have plans waiting. Berkeley's been turned down for 2 projects that were ostensibly sea level rise projects for aquatic park And Aquatic Park is one of my favorites, but they were rejected because they were maintenance, because there hadn't been any new planning done. So there's money finally for Liam to work on updating the plans that go back to 2012 and put sea level rise in. Those would qualify for matching planning funds for adapting to rising tides, money from the Coastal Conservancy, and there was a huge influx of money promised from the budget, the California budget last year that starts to come into effect. To avail yourself of those, there has to be a cooperative planning agreement. It has to involve Caltrans, because all of the culverts that define sea level rise for Berkeley as a whole go through Caltrans property. There's nobody working on it at the city. That needs to be done before you're competitive.
Thank you. All right, we're going to do one or two more questions because I'd like you both to have your time for your closing remarks. So I do apologize to those questions we don't get to ask today. You can always follow up offline. Mr. Mayor, for you, what does Measure L mean for Berkeley College students, specifically in terms of future rents?
Well, I think rent's already pretty high in Berkeley. But just as an aside, I do think that this is beneficial for university students. I hear often about the concern about the availability of affordable housing and as well about the need for safer streets. Many students walk and bike to and from campus. And increasingly, we're seeing collisions of pedestrians and cyclists on our streets. So this is going to enable us to do things like the Telegraph Shared Streets Plan, which I know many students are in favor of. We're looking at how we can put in protected bicycle infrastructure. We can design our streets to be safer for pedestrians. So that's definitely something I think is beneficial for students as well. Aside from as well, having more resources for us to address the crisis of homelessness, which I know directly impacts students. We have housing insecure students in our city, and to create affordable homes, some of which students can live in. So I think there's a lot of benefit, and I think that's why the Cal Berkeley Democrats is supporting Measure L. That's why the Associated Students of the University of California is supporting Measure L, because they recognize that this is good for students and long-term residents of our city and for the future of our city.
Mr. McGrath.
I don't see anything in here specifically that targets housing for students. I do see finally in the report that was produced for the council meeting on Tuesday, some details about replacement housing for the people who were in People's Park. Very difficult issue. What's the balance in the relationship between the city and the university in providing housing for students? How will affordable housing done through this, which is oriented, as Jesse has said, to people who are homeless, and the delivery on that's actually pretty good. Most of it has been for people making less than 60% of the average. How does that benefit the students? What's the balance between what you do with grants, what you do with the affordable housing provisions in the ordinance that require a certain amount of housing to be set aside, and what are the responsibilities? Those are all really complicated questions. I would sure like to see specifics, but well, I'll stop there.
Okay. This will be our last question, and then we'll move on to closing statements. And I do just want to let everyone know we will post this recording on our website later this afternoon, so you'll be welcome to rewatch it there. Okay, we'll start with Mr. Mayor on this one. If every matching dollar becomes available, we'd have $1.2 billion to deliver the stated goal of creating 1,500 affordable housing units. That's 800,000 per unit. Yes, we're a thoughtful and compassionate city, but that comes with strings attached, namely accountability. What guardrails are in place to lower this per unit cost? Would the city be willing to use non-union construction contractors to build some of this housing to lower costs and possibly deliver more units?
Well, several things. One, the money could go not just new construction, but the acquisition and rehabilitation of existing properties. And there's not a lot of land available in Berkeley to build new housing. And so really key to our affordable housing strategy is going to be buying existing buildings, fixing them up and making them permanently affordable, like we did at the McGee Avenue Baptist Church and like we did on Solano Avenue. And the costs of those projects are significantly less, 200, maybe 300,000 per unit than what the new build cost is. So that's one component of this, not just new construction, but also acquisition and rehabilitation of existing housing. In addition, we do need to make it easier to build affordable housing. We need to streamline the process. We do need to promote innovation in how we construct housing, like prefabricated housing and micro units as a way to lower the costs. All those things are things that I do think can bring the costs down, but that can't happen if we don't have the money. So if Measure L doesn't pass, we will not have the significant scale resources to build or rehab any new affordable housing. We'll have to rely on money trickling in little by little and hope that we have enough to be able to do about a few projects, which is where we were until Measure O passed. Before Measure O passed, we were able to probably allocate, fund one project a year, maybe. With Measure O, we've been able to help build and help seed money for many projects in our city throughout our city. And so we need to continue the momentum that we started with Measure O. And there is accountability. We have a housing advisory commission. We have housing trust fund guidelines with very clear requirements about how to evaluate and prioritize projects. And at the end of the day, it goes to the city council in a public forum, in a public vote to make a decision. That's the process we used with Measure O. I think we can all agree it's been effective. Just walk by Berkeley Way, just go at the corner of Cedar and Oxford and see the finished product. The proof is in the projects.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, would you care to comment?
Can you repeat the question, please?
I can. If every matching dollar becomes available, we'd have $1.2 billion to deliver the stated goal of creating 1,500 affordable housing units. That's 800,000 per unit. What guardrails are in place to lower this per unit cost? Would the city be willing to use non-union construction contractors to build some of this housing to lower costs and deliver more units?
Well, there's a couple points here. I agree with much of what Jesse said. I think we have to look at purchasing buildings. I think we have to do it more transparently. And I'm not going to bite on the non-union. This is a union town. This is a Democratic town. I'm not going to go searching for $50,000 or $80,000 worth of campaign contributions to run a Yes on campaign from the union. But I'm not going to say that they're not going to have a role or that there wouldn't be a project labor agreement. This is a union town. The fact that we can leverage dollars is important. But the question and the need for further planning, I mean, first of all, when I first started looking at this, I asked the question, do we have a housing problem or do we have something that's poorly messaged? A lot of it's poorly messaged. When we finally got a report, the first one since March 2021, and it came with a whole bunch of stuff on a very long packet for Tuesday, and I read it in a lot of detail yesterday. There's a pretty good story to be told there. The question is, what are you going to do with the money's not all gone. With all due respect, what that report says is only $78 million worth of the $135 million bonds have actually been pulled down. What would the next 200 be with the shortage of land? What are the opportunities out there? How does that get done? But I was actually, once I finally got information, which hadn't been presented in so long, I was impressed with what the staff had been done. I think we can craft a measure with the accountability that's been added after the fact in the measure, and probably Jesse and I would reach agreement on that. And with my measure, now not everybody that's opposing the bond is quite as gung-ho on housing as I am, but that's something that I'm committed to working towards a consensus on. That doesn't happen when you put a measure together the last 6 days before the deadline.
All right. Thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. I'd like to now give you each 4 minutes to say any final thoughts and make your final sell. So Mr. McGrath, we'll start with you and then we'll close out with the mayor.
Okay, I think I've made it clear that housing is a priority for me, for most of the members of my steering committee, and that we don't think Berkeley has done necessarily a bad job. What needs to be added is transparency and more frequent oversight. I already told you how few meetings have been held. I told you that there hadn't been a report for some period of time. Having the measure that was drafted on Tuesday, finally, 2 months after measure was put on the ballot, and the day that the ballot started to arrive in people's mailbox, is a significant improvement. But I don't think it's binding on future city councils over the next 18 years. It would be binding if it was written into each individual bond agreement for housing. And if that was a standalone project, as many say, I would hold my nose. On streets, I'm in a fundamentally different position. I don't want my grandchildren paying for me to have smooth streets for 4 to 7 years. Yes, we need to do a lot of work. Yes, it can be done with a parcel tax. Yes, it's going to take 20, maybe 30 years, just as the public works director defined them. I'm absolutely willing, and I pledge to work to draft such measures with the council, with a council subcommittee, or with the initiative process. I think I have some credibility here. I spent 17 years working on infrastructure in Berkeley. I did it all for free.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having this important conversation. And I do recognize that there's a lot of agreement amongst the both perspectives on Measure L. I think we all recognize that we need affordable housing. We all recognize that we need to fix our streets. We need to improve our infrastructure, but we have a disagreement about how to achieve that. And I don't believe that we can wait for some unknown future point, and costs are going to keep increasing. We have more people experiencing homelessness. Our streets are in poor condition. They're not safe for bicyclists and pedestrians. We're losing out on leveraging federal dollars, and hope that that's going to be in the best interest of the city. What we have before us is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to invest, renew, and improve the future of our city. And if you look at the history of our city, it's been people that have stepped forward to do big things and to make the investments that have transformed our city. And I think we all have that opportunity here with Measure L to achieve that. And so this is an ambitious proposal, but it's in recognition of, one, the priorities that we heard from the people of Berkeley, affordable housing and infrastructure. And two, it's addressing decades of deferred maintenance and also putting forward a equitable, sustainable, and resilient path for the future of our city. And so I really call on all the residents of Berkeley to please join us, a unanimous Berkeley City Council who put this measure on the ballot. Let me tell you, not often that we have a unanimous city council who agrees on anything. But we put this measure forward based on extensive input from our boards and commissions, 2 scientific surveys, as well as community forums to identify the priorities and categories and projects that we had included in Measure L. They joined the Alameda County Democratic Party, the Sierra Club, the League of Women Voters, Berkeley Firefighters Association, the East Bay Housing Organizations, Senator Nancy Skinner, Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks, Supervisor Keith Carson, our city auditor, Jenny Wong, our former Senator Lonnie Hancock, and former Mayor Tom Bates, nearly a majority of our school board, nearly every elected official who represents the city of Berkeley is united in support of Measure L. Nearly every organization that endorsed in this race is endorsing Measure L. Why? Because we recognize that the time has come for us to invest in the future of our city, that we need to continue the progress that we've made to address our housing crisis. We need to fix our streets now. We need to fix our civic center and renew our waterfront now. And so I really call on the people of Berkeley to please join us in supporting Measure L and email me directly, jarreguin@gmail.com. That's my email. If you have any questions, I would love to engage in a conversation with anyone about this measure and to be able to answer your questions to address what I, sad to say, is a great deal of misinformation or misunderstanding that's been put forward by opponents. and to be able to answer your questions and engage in conversation. jarreguin@gmail.com, our website, once again, renewberkeley, all one word, .org. Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, I'd like to thank both of you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. McGrath. This has been a wonderful discussion. I encourage everyone on this forum, no matter which way you lean, to just get out there and cast your vote before or on November 8th. Again, we'll post a recording of this debate on our website later this afternoon, and we'll send you all the link. So thank you again on behalf of Berkeley Chamber. Thank you to our timekeeper and our admin, and I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.